Sometimes the most broken hearts find each other when they need it most. On a dusty train platform in 1884, a wealthy cattle rancher named Jeremiah Boone was about to discover that love doesn't always come the way you expect it. He'd been alone for 20 years after losing his wife, building walls around his heart as high as his fortune was deep. But that September evening, he found a 7-year-old girl named Clara sitting on an old suitcase, abandoned and crying, with nothing but a teddy bear to keep her company. The train had left her behind, and so had whoever brought her there. Most folks would have walked on by, figured it was someone else's problem. But Jeremiah looked into those scared little eyes and saw something that changed everything. He knelt down, took her tiny hand in his weathered one, and made a choice that would heal them both. What happens when a man who's given up on family finds a child who needs one more than anything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evening shadows stretched long across the wooden platform as Jeremiah Boone stepped down from the stagecoach, his boots hitting the weathered planks with a sound that spoke of authority and purpose. At 52, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had built something substantial from nothing. His shoulders broad beneath a well-tailored coat that cost more than most folks in Cedar Ridge made in a year. The gold pocket watch tucked in his vest bore the initials SMB, Sarah Margaret Boone, etched in elegant script, a reminder of the woman who had shared his dreams for all too brief a time. He'd come to town on business, as he did every month, checking on his investments at the bank, meeting with the railroad representatives about shipping contracts for his cattle. The Boone Creek Ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Montana Territory, home to nearly 3,000 head of prime beef cattle. It was an empire built on sweat, determination, and the kind of loneliness that money couldn't cure. But tonight, something was different. The child sat motionless on a battered leather suitcase, her small frame dwarfed by the cavernous train station. Her dress, once probably blue, had faded to the color of winter sky, and her brown hair hung in limp tangles around a face that bore the streaks of dried tears. In her arms, she clutched a teddy bear that had seen better days, one eye missing, fur worn thin from countless nights of comfort sought and sometimes found. Jeremiah had intended to walk straight to his horse, tied at the hitching post outside Morton's saloon. He had correspondence to review, accounts to reconcile, and the familiar routine of his solitary evening ahead. But something about the way the child held herself, so still, so resigned to whatever fate might find her, made him pause. "Where's your folks, little one?" he asked, his voice gentle despite its natural gruffness. The girl looked up, with eyes the color of autumn leaves, wide and frightened, but holding a maturity that no 7-year-old should possess. She didn't speak, just shook her head slowly, clutching the teddy bear tighter to her chest. Jeremiah glanced around the empty platform. The evening train had departed 20 minutes ago, heading east toward Chicago, with a whistle that still echoed in his memory. The station master, old Henry Kruger, was already locking up for the night, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the depot walls. "Henry," Jeremiah called, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "What's the story with this child?" Henry approached, shaking his graying head with the weariness of a man who'd seen too much of life's cruelties. "Came in on the westbound this afternoon," he said, keeping his voice low. "Woman put her off the train, said someone would be waiting. Left her that suitcase and walked away without looking back. Been sitting there ever since. No one came for her? Not a soul. I telegraphed the sheriff, but he's dealing with that mining dispute up in Silver Creek. Won't be back till tomorrow at the earliest." Jeremiah felt something shift in his chest, a stirring he hadn't experienced in 2 decades. He looked down at the child again, noting the way her thin shoulders trembled despite the evening's warmth. The teddy bear's remaining eye seemed to regard him with silent pleading. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, crouching down to her level. "Clara," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze that rattled the depot's loose shutters. "Clara's a beautiful name." "I'm Jeremiah Boone. Do you know who was supposed to meet you here?" She shook her head again, then spoke in that same whisper. "Mama said someone would come. But she's gone now." The words hit him like a physical blow. Sarah had said something similar once near the end, promising that someone would come to help her through the pain of childbirth. But no one had come, and he'd lost both his wife and the child they'd dreamed of raising together. Jeremiah stood slowly, his mind working through possibilities and obligations. The right thing would be to take Clara to Mrs. Pemberton at the boarding house. Let the proper authorities sort out her situation in the morning. But something about the way she looked at him, not with the calculated manipulation he'd seen in other children, but with a desperate hope that broke his heart, made him reconsider. "Are you hungry, Clara?" She nodded, and he saw her grip loosen slightly on the teddy bear. "Well then, I think we'd better get you some supper. My ranch isn't far from here, and my cook makes the finest beef stew in the territory." The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. Clara's shoulders straightened just a fraction, and for the first time, something that might have been hope flickered in her eyes. The ride to Boone Creek Ranch took 40 minutes in Jeremiah's buckboard. Clara sitting beside him on the worn leather seat, her suitcase and teddy bear secure in the wagon bed. She didn't speak during the journey, but he could feel her watching the landscape roll by. Endless grassland painted silver by moonlight. The distant silhouettes of mountains etched against a star-filled sky. His home appeared gradually, first as distant lights twinkling in the darkness, then as a sprawling two-story house built of local timber and Montana stone. The wraparound porch stretched wide and welcoming, supported by columns hewn from pine trees that had once stood on this very land. Behind the main house, the bunkhouse glowed with warm light, and the sounds of evening carried on the breeze, cattle lowing in the distance, the soft nickering of horses in the paddock. "Holy Mother of God," Miguel Rodriguez muttered in his accented English as Jeremiah walked into the kitchen with Clara at his side. The ranch cook, a barrel-chested man in his 60s, with gentle eyes and hands that could turn the toughest beef into tender perfection, set down his coffee cup and stared. "Boss, where did you find this little angel?" "At the train station. She needs supper and a place to sleep for the night." Miguel's wife Elena, who helped with the household duties, immediately bustled forward with the maternal instincts that had made her beloved by every ranch hand who'd ever worked for Jeremiah. "Pobrecita," she murmured, kneeling to Clara's level. "You're safe now, little one. Elena will take good care of you." Old Pete Morrison, Jeremiah's foreman for the past 15 years, looked up from the ledger he'd been reviewing at the kitchen table. His weather-beaten face, lined by decades of sun and wind, softened when he saw Clara. "Well, I'll be," he said quietly. "Ain't she a little beauty?" Young Tommy Walsh, barely 18, and the newest addition to the ranch crew, stood up so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. "Evening, Mr. Boone, miss," he added, touching his hat brim politely to Clara. Within minutes, Elena had Clara seated at the large oak table, with a bowl of Miguel's famous stew, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and a glass of cold milk from their own dairy cows. Clara ate slowly but steadily, her eyes darting occasionally to the adults around her, as if expecting to be told she didn't belong. Jeremiah found himself studying her face in the lamplight, noting the fine bone structure that spoke of good breeding, the intelligence that flickered behind her wariness. There was something familiar about her features, though he couldn't place what it might be. "Clara," he said gently, "can you tell us about your mama? Where did you come from?" She looked up from her bowl, a spoonful of stew halfway to her mouth. "Denver. Mama got sick. The lady at the church said I had to go to family. And your papa?" Her face darkened and she shook her head firmly. "No papa. Mama said he went away before I was born." Elena made a soft sound of sympathy, and Pete shifted uncomfortably in his chair. They all knew the story. A woman alone, struggling to raise a child, finally succumbing to whatever illness or hardship had claimed her life. After supper, Elena led Clara upstairs to one of the guest rooms. chattering softly in a mixture of English and Spanish that seemed to soothe the child's nerves. Jeremiah could hear water running in the wash basin, Elena's gentle voice explaining where things were, the soft sounds of a child being cared for by someone who understood the art of tenderness. He stood on the front porch, smoking his evening pipe and staring out at the vast expanse of his land. The pocket watch felt heavy in his vest, a reminder of promises made and broken by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Sarah would have known what to do. She'd always had a way with children, a natural maternal instinct that had made their dreams of a large family seem not just possible, but inevitable. "She's a good little thing," Pete said, joining him on the porch steps. "Scared, but there's steel in her backbone. Takes a strong spirit to sit alone at a train station and not fall apart completely. What am I supposed to do with her, Pete?" The foreman was quiet for a long moment, packing tobacco into his own pipe with the deliberate movements of a man who'd learned to think before speaking. "I reckon you'll figure that out when you need to. But I'll tell you this, that little girl in there looks at you like you hung the moon. Don't see that kind of trust very often." Jeremiah knew Pete was right. There had been something in Clara's eyes during supper, a gradual relaxing of her guard as she'd watched him interact with his crew, seen the respect and affection that flowed between them. She was smart enough to recognize genuine kindness when she encountered it. Elena appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on her apron. "She's in bed, Senor Boone. Asked for you to come up and say good night." He found Clara tucked beneath one of Sarah's quilts in the blue guest room, her teddy bear clutched against her chest. In the soft lamplight, with her hair clean and braided by Eleanor's patient hands, she looked even younger and more vulnerable than she had at the train station. "This is a nice room," she said softly, running her small hand over the quilt's intricate pattern. "The lady who made this must have been very good at sewing." "My wife made it," Jeremiah replied, settling into the chair beside the bed. "She liked to keep her hands busy during the winter months. Where is she now?" The question was asked with the directness of childhood, innocent of the pain it might cause. "She died a long time ago." "Before you were born." Clara absorbed this information with the solemn consideration of a child who'd learned that adults sometimes left and never came back. "I'm sorry she died. She must have been nice if she made pretty quilts. She was the nicest person I ever knew. My mama was nice, too. She used to sing to me when I couldn't sleep." Jeremiah felt his throat tighten. "What did she sing?" Clara's voice, soft and sweet, filled the quiet room. "Hush now, my darling. Don't you cry. Mama's here beneath the sky. Stars are watching from above, keeping you safe with all their love." The simple melody, sung in a child's pure voice, seemed to wrap around his heart with gentle fingers. Sarah had hummed something similar during those brief, shining months when they'd believed their dreams were coming true. "That's beautiful, Clara. Your mama taught you well." She nodded sleepily. "Mr. Boone, will you be here in the morning?" "I'll be here. Promise." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of a child's desperate need for security. Jeremiah looked into those trusting eyes and felt something shift permanently in his chest, like a door that had been locked for 20 years, suddenly swinging open. "I promise." Clara smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into the peaceful rhythm of childhood sleep, her teddy bear standing guard against whatever dreams might come. Jeremiah sat for a long time in the quiet room, watching her sleep and trying to understand what had happened to him in the space of a single evening. He'd built his life around routines and solitude, convinced himself that he was content with his cattle and his books and the familiar rhythms of ranch life. But this child had walked into his world and changed everything simply by needing him. The pocket watch chimed softly. 11 o'clock. Tomorrow would bring questions and decisions, practical matters that couldn't be solved with a warm meal and a safe bed. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, the big house didn't feel empty. Tonight, there was someone else breathing under his roof. Someone who looked at him with trust and hope instead of the careful deference he'd grown accustomed to. He rose quietly and turned down the lamp, leaving the room bathed in moonlight that streamed through the lace curtains Sarah had hung so long ago. At the doorway, he paused for one last look at the sleeping child and whispered a prayer to whatever forces had conspired to bring her into his life. Outside, the Montana night stretched vast and star-filled above the ranch, and Jeremiah Boone began to imagine, for the first time in decades, what tomorrow might bring. The morning sun painted the kitchen windows gold when Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, her teddy bear in one arm and her small hand trailing along the banister. She dressed herself in yesterday's clothes, and Elena immediately clucked her tongue with motherly disapproval. "No, no, pequeña," Elena said, bustling toward the stairs. "We must get you proper clothes. Come, we see what we can find." But Clara's eyes sought Jeremiah first, needing the reassurance of his presence before she could trust in the kindness of others. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and the territorial newspaper, and when he looked up and smiled at her, something tight in her chest loosened. "Good morning, Clara. Did you sleep well?" She nodded, still clutching her teddy bear. The bed was soft, and the quilt smelled like flowers. "Lavender," he said. Sarah used to put dried lavender in the drawers to keep everything fresh. Elena had found some of Sarah's old dresses in the cedar chest, things that had been too precious to give away, but too painful to look at. With her skillful hands and a sewing basket, she transformed a pale yellow dress into something that fit Clara's small frame, chattering all the while about breakfast and the kittens in the barn that would love to meet a little girl. Clara ate quietly, her eyes taking in everything, the way Miguel hummed while he cooked, how Pete consulted with Jeremiah about the day's work, the easy camaraderie between the men who clearly loved and respected their boss. When Tommy offered to show her the horses after breakfast, she looked to Jeremiah first, seeking permission. "Go ahead," he encouraged. "Buttercup is the gentlest mare in the territory. She'd love to meet you." The next 2 days passed in a haze of new experiences for Clara. She helped Elena gather eggs, watched Miguel milk the cows, and followed Pete around as he checked the fences near the house. But it was with Jeremiah that she seemed most at ease, sitting beside him on the porch in the evenings, listening to stories about the ranch's history and the cattle drives of years past. She was beginning to speak more, asking questions about the animals and the vast landscape that surrounded them. When Jeremiah taught her to whistle for the dogs, her delighted laughter rang across the yard like music none of them had heard in far too long. On the third morning, Sheriff Harold Morton rode up the dusty path to the house, his bay gelding lathered with sweat from hard riding. Jeremiah met him on the porch, Clara trailing behind like a small shadow. "Jeremiah," the sheriff said, dismounting with the weariness of a man who carried difficult news, "we need to talk." The tin badge on Morton's vest caught the morning sun, and Clara instinctively moved closer to Jeremiah's side. She'd learned to read the subtle signs of adult tension, the way voices changed and faces grew serious when trouble was coming. "Found Clara's people," Morton continued, glancing at the child with sympathy. "Got a response to the telegrams I sent out. Child's got an aunt in Chicago, Gertrude Pemberton. Woman's been looking for her since she heard about her sister's death." Jeremiah felt the world shift beneath his feet. Her sister? Clara's mother was Catherine Pemberton. Died of consumption in Denver about 2 weeks ago. The church folks there did their best to find family. Finally tracked down this Gertrude woman through some old letters. Clara had gone very still beside him, her small hand gripping his trouser leg with desperate strength. The teddy bear hung forgotten in her other arm. "Aunt Gertie," she whispered, and there was something in her voice, fear, recognition, memory of pain. Morton pulled a telegram from his shirt pocket. "Mrs. Pemberton wants the child sent to Chicago immediately. Says she's Clara's only living relative and has full legal right to custody." "I'm sorry, Jeremiah, but the law's clear on this matter. What do you know about this woman?" "Widow. Lives alone in a big house on the north side. Seems respectable enough. Got money from her late husband's business dealings." Clara tugged on Jeremiah's pants leg, her voice urgent and frightened. "Mr. Boone, I don't want to go to Aunt Gertie." She was mean to Mama. She made Mama cry. The adults exchanged glances over her head. Morton shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he was anywhere else, but delivering news that would cause such obvious distress. "Clara," Jeremiah said gently, kneeling down to her level. "Can you tell us about your Aunt Gertie?" The child's face crumpled, and tears began to slide down her cheeks. "She came to see us once. She said Mama was a disgrace, and that I was a burden. She hit Mama when Mama tried to explain about my papa. She said terrible things about me not having a real family." Jeremiah's jaw tightened, and he pulled Clara against his chest, feeling her small body shake with sobs. Over her head he met Morton's troubled gaze. "How long do we have?" "She wants Clara on the next eastbound train. That's Thursday, day after tomorrow. I'm sorry, Jeremiah. I know you've grown attached to the little one, but blood is blood. The law favors family, especially when there's no other legal claim." After the sheriff left, Clara disappeared. Elena found her in the barn, huddled in Buttercup's stall, with her arms wrapped around the gentle mare's neck, crying into the horse's mane. The teddy bear sat propped against the stall door, as if standing guard against a world that kept taking away everything she loved. "I don't want to go," she whispered, when Eleanor coaxed her out of the stall. "I want to stay here with Papa Jeremiah and you and Miguel and everybody. This is home now." The word Papa hit Jeremiah like a physical blow when Elena repeated it to him. In 3 short days, this child had crawled into his heart and made herself at home. And now the law was going to tear her away and send her to a woman who had already shown herself to be cruel and heartless. That evening, Clara barely touched her supper. She sat at the table, pushing food around on her plate, while the adults spoke in careful, measured tones about practical matters, train schedules and telegraph costs, and the proper procedures for transferring custody of a child. "Mr. Boone," Clara said suddenly, her voice cutting through the adult conversation. "If I'm very good, can I stay? I promise I won't be any trouble. I'll help with the chores and learn to milk cows and everything." The silence that followed was heavy with heartbreak. Jeremiah reached across the table and took her small hand in his weathered one. "Clara, sweetheart, it's not about being good or bad. You're perfect just the way you are. Sometimes grown-ups have to follow rules that don't make sense to children. But Aunt Gertie doesn't love me. You do." The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything civilized society claimed to value. Here was a child who had found love and safety, and the law was going to drag her away from it in the name of blood relations that meant nothing but pain and obligation. "Yes," Jeremiah said quietly. "I do love you, Clara, more than I thought possible." That night Clara couldn't sleep. She appeared at Jeremiah's study door in her white nightgown, her teddy bear dragging behind her on the floor. "I'm scared," she whispered. He lifted her onto his lap, and she curled against his chest like a small, wounded animal seeking shelter. Through the window, the vast Montana landscape stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars. Beautiful and peaceful, and everything that Clara would be leaving behind. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Will you remember me after I go away? Every day for the rest of my life. Will you tell Buttercup that I didn't want to leave her?" "I will." She was quiet for a long time, and he thought she might have fallen asleep. But then she spoke again, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "Mama told me once that angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they look like regular people, and they come when you need them most. I think you might be my angel, Papa Jeremiah." As he carried her back to her room and tucked her under Sarah's quilt, Jeremiah made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't let this child go to a woman who would see her as nothing more than a burden or a means to an end. There had to be another way, some legal loophole, some argument that could keep Clara where she belonged. But first, he needed to understand exactly what they were fighting against. Tomorrow, he would send his own telegram to Chicago, and he would learn everything there was to know about Gertrude Pemberton. The fight for Clara's future was just beginning. Before dawn broke over the Montana plains, Jeremiah was already saddling his horse for the ride into Cedar Ridge. The telegram he needed to send couldn't wait for the stagecoach, and every hour mattered now. Clara's deadline loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon, and he intended to fight it with every legal weapon at his disposal. The law office of William Hartley sat above the barber shop on Main Street, its windows overlooking the dusty thoroughfare that served as the town's commercial heart. Hartley had been Jeremiah's attorney for 15 years, handling everything from land purchases to cattle contracts, but he'd never been asked to fight for a child's future. Adoption? Hartley repeated, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed the territorial statutes. Jeremiah, you're talking about a complex legal process that typically takes months, even under the best circumstances. And this aunt has prior claim. Blood relation trumps everything in family court. Jeremiah paced the small office like a caged wolf, his boots wearing a path in the threadbare carpet. There has to be something. Some precedent, some argument we can make. Well, Hartley said slowly, flipping through his legal books, there is the question of the child's best interests. If we could prove that this aunt is unfit, or that Clara would be better served remaining here, but that's a difficult standard to meet. We'd need substantial evidence. The child is terrified of her. That should count for something. The testimony of a 7-year-old carries limited weight in court, especially against the claims of a blood relative. We'd need more, evidence of abuse, neglect, or moral unfitness. Jeremiah felt frustration building in his chest like steam in a boiler. In his world, problems were solved through hard work and determination. Cattle needed to be moved, they got moved. Fences needed mending, they got mended. But the law was different, full of precedents and procedures that seemed designed to prevent swift action rather than enable it. Meanwhile, at the ranch, Clara was discovering what it meant to have people who cared about her well-being. Elena had spent the morning teaching her to knead bread dough, her patient hands guiding Clara's small ones as they worked the mixture into smooth, elastic perfection. Like this, mija, Elena said, her voice gentle. Feel how the dough talks to your hands? It tells you when it's ready. Clara pressed her palms into the warm dough, marveling at its transformation under her touch. It's like magic, she whispered. See, a little bit magic, but mostly love. Everything we make with love tastes better. In the afternoon, Pete found Clara sitting by the paddock fence, watching the horses graze in the autumn sunshine. Buttercup had wandered over to investigate, her velvet nose sniffing curiously at Clara's outstretched palm. She likes you, Pete observed, settling onto the fence rail beside her. That mare's got good judgment about people. Mr. Pete, why do grown-ups make rules that hurt children? The question caught him off guard with its directness and wisdom. Pete removed his hat and scratched his graying head, searching for an answer that would make sense to a child's heart. Well, little missy, I reckon most rules start out meaning to do good. Problem is, sometimes they get so tangled up in the doing that they forget about the caring. Clara absorbed this, her small face serious. Mama used to say that rules should help people, not hurt them. Your mama sounds like she was a smart woman. When Jeremiah returned that evening, he found Clara in his study, carefully examining the contents of a wooden box she'd discovered on a high shelf. Her small hands held Sarah's wedding ring, a simple gold band that had never left his wife's finger until the day they'd laid her to rest. I'm sorry, Clara said quickly, seeing his expression. I didn't mean to touch anything. I was just looking at the books, and the box fell down. Jeremiah knelt beside her, his heart constricting as he saw the ring cradled in her palm like a small, precious bird. For 20 years, he'd kept it locked away, unable to bear the sight of it, but unwilling to let it go. It's all right, sweetheart. That belonged to my wife, Sarah. It's beautiful, Clara said, studying the simple band in the lamplight. Did you love her very much? More than anything in the world, like you love me now? The innocent question struck him like lightning. Until this moment, he hadn't fully acknowledged the depth of what he felt for this child, how completely she'd filled the empty spaces in his heart, how natural it felt to worry about her happiness and plan for her future. Yes, he said quietly. Exactly like that. Clara carefully placed the ring back in its velvet-lined box, her movements reverent and gentle. Mama told me that love doesn't die even when people do. She said it finds new places to live, like seeds that blow in the wind and grow wherever they land. That evening, Clara sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and some colored pencils Elena had found in the supply closet. Her tongue poked out slightly as she concentrated, her small hand moving carefully across the page. When she finished, she presented her artwork to Jeremiah with shy pride. The drawing showed two figures standing in front of a house, a tall man in a cowboy hat and a small girl with brown pigtails. Between them, a heart was drawn in red crayon, connecting their stick-figure hands. "That's you and me," Clara explained unnecessarily. At our house, Jeremiah studied the drawing, noting the careful details, the horses in the background, the mountains on the horizon, the sun smiling down from a blue sky. But it was the title written across the bottom in Clara's careful child's handwriting that made his throat tighten. "My family, Clara. This is the most beautiful picture I've ever seen." She beamed at the praise, then grew serious. "Papa Jeremiah, if I have to go to Aunt Gertie's, will you keep it so you remember what we looked like when we were happy?" The words hit him like a physical blow. This child had already learned that happiness was temporary, that love could be taken away without warning or explanation. But she was still brave enough to create beauty, to capture joy on paper, even as she faced the possibility of losing everything that mattered to her. "Clara," he said, pulling her onto his lap, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. I'm going to do everything in my power to keep you here where you belong. Do you understand?" "Everything." She nodded against his chest, and he felt her small arms tighten around his neck. In the lamplight of the kitchen, surrounded by the people who had become her family, Clara Boone, for that's how he'd begun to think of her, held on to hope with the fierce determination of a child who had already survived too much loss. Outside, the Montana night was clear and cold, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Somewhere to the east, in a city Clara barely remembered, Gertrude Pemberton was making plans for a child she saw as an obligation rather than a gift. But here, in this warm kitchen filled with love and laughter, the battle for Clara's future was just beginning, and Jeremiah Boone had no intention of surrendering without a fight. The morning of Clara's planned departure dawned grey and cold, with storm clouds gathering over the distant peaks like harbingers of sorrow. But Jeremiah had no intention of putting Clara on that eastbound train, not without exploring every possible alternative first. "We're going to town," he announced at breakfast, noting how Clara's face brightened at the prospect of staying busy instead of sitting at the ranch. Counting down her final hours, Cedar Ridge bustled with its usual morning activity as Jeremiah's buckboard rolled down Main Street. Clara sat beside him, wearing one of the dresses Elena had altered for her, her hair neatly braided and her beloved teddy bear tucked securely in her arms. Several townspeople waved and called out greetings, their faces showing genuine warmth for the child who had captured everyone's attention. Their first stop was Henderson's General Store, where Martha Henderson presided over bolts of fabric, canned goods, and the town's unofficial information network. A former schoolteacher from Boston, Martha had come west with her husband 20 years earlier and established herself as Cedar Ridge's most educated and influential woman. "Mr. Boone," she said, emerging from behind the counter with a warm smile. "And you must be Clara. I've heard so much about you, dear." Clara curtsied politely, a gesture that spoke of careful training from her late mother. "Thank you, ma'am. Your store is very nice." "Well, aren't you a little lady?" Martha's eyes met Jeremiah's over Clara's head, and he could see the understanding there. This woman knew exactly why they'd come. As Clara wandered among the displays, marveling at penny candy and hair ribbons, Martha spoke quietly to Jeremiah. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said. "That child needs proper schooling, and I'd be honored to tutor her. A mind like hers shouldn't go to waste. You can tell she's bright, exceptionally so. Watch her. She's reading the labels on everything, doing arithmetic in her head with the prices. Most children her age can barely write their names." Clara had indeed found the small selection of books Martha kept for the few literate families in town. She stood on tiptoe, trying to reach a volume of fairy tales on a high shelf. "Here, sweetheart," Jeremiah said, lifting the book down for her. "Would you like to have this?" Her eyes widened with wonder. "Really, I can keep it?" "Of course." As Clara hugged the book to her chest like a treasure, Martha spoke with quiet conviction. "That child belongs with you, Jeremiah. Anyone with eyes can see it." Their next stop was Dr. William Matthews' office, where the aging physician examined Clara with gentle thoroughness. A Yale-trained doctor who'd come west for his health, Matthews had the respect of everyone in the territory. "Remarkable," he murmured, checking Clara's reflexes. "This child has been through trauma, no doubt about it, but she's resilient. Strong constitution, good bone structure, excellent cognitive responses." He looked at Jeremiah meaningfully. "She's thriving under your care. I'd be happy to testify to that effect if needed." At the church, Pastor Williams welcomed them with open arms. A man of genuine faith and practical wisdom, he'd officiated at Sarah's funeral and watched Jeremiah struggle through 20 years of solitude. "Clara," he said, kneeling to her level, "would you like to see our Sunday school room? We have books and games for children." While Clara explored the small classroom, Pastor Williams spoke earnestly to Jeremiah. "I've seen many families in my 30 years of ministry. What I see between you and that child is rare and precious, a true spiritual bond. No court should break that apart." But their most important stop was the courthouse, where they sought out Judge Augustus Whitman, a territorial appointment with a reputation for fairness. Judge Whitman had presided over Jeremiah's legal affairs for years. "This is highly irregular," the judge said, studying Clara as she sat quietly in his office, her drawing pad open on her lap. "You're asking me to interfere with established custody laws. I'm asking you to consider what's best for the child." Judge Whitman was quiet for a long moment, watching Clara as she sketched the view from his window, the mountains in the distance, the cottonwoods lining the creek. Her artistic talent was evident even to an untrained eye. "Young lady," he said gently, "can you tell me about your aunt in Chicago?" Clara's pencil stopped moving, and she looked up with those wise, sad eyes that seemed too old for her face. "She doesn't like children, sir. She told Mama that I was God's punishment for her sins." The judge's expression darkened. "Did she ever hurt you?" "She made Mama cry, and she said I should be grateful if anyone was willing to take me because I was nobody's real daughter." Judge Whitman exchanged a meaningful glance with Jeremiah. "Thank you for being honest, Clara. Would you like to wait outside while Mr. Boone and I finish talking?" When Clara had left with her drawing pad, settling on a bench in the hallway, Judge Whitman spoke bluntly. "Jeremiah, I've known you for 15 years. You're a man of integrity and substantial means, clearly capable of providing for a child. But the law is the law. Blood relations take precedence, especially when there's no evidence of abuse or unfitness. What would constitute evidence? Documented incidents of cruelty, testimony from witnesses, evidence of moral turpitude or mental instability. Without that, my hands are tied." That afternoon they visited Clara's favorite spot at the ranch, a meadow where wildflowers still bloomed despite the approaching winter. Buttercup grazed nearby while Clara and Jeremiah sat beneath an old oak tree, sharing an apple and watching clouds drift across the vast sky. "Papa Jeremiah," Clara said quietly, "I had a dream last night about Mama. She said that sometimes good things come from sad things, like flowers growing from burned ground. What do you think she meant? Maybe she meant that even if I have to go away, something good will still come from us loving each other. Like maybe you won't be so lonely anymore. And maybe I'll remember that somebody thought I was worth keeping." Jeremiah pulled her close, feeling the fierce protectiveness that had become as natural as breathing. "Clara, you are worth everything. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Clara made a confession that broke his heart. "I used to pray that God would send me a papa who would love me and never go away. When I saw you at the train station, I thought maybe he finally heard me. But maybe I asked for too much." "You didn't ask for too much, sweetheart. You asked for exactly what every child deserves, As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Jeremiah made a silent vow. Tomorrow, when Sheriff Morton came to take Clara to the train station, he would be ready with arguments and allies. But if the law failed them, if all their careful planning came to nothing, he would not let this child go to a woman who saw her as a burden rather than a blessing. Some things were worth fighting for, and Clara was worth everything. The telegraph message arrived at dawn, delivered by young Billy Morrison, who rode his pony hard from town to earn the 50 cents Jeremiah paid for urgent communications. The yellow paper crackled in Jeremiah's hands as he read. Gertrude Pemberton's increasingly harsh demands. Child must be sent immediately. Stop, have legal papers. Prepared, stop, no further delays. Acceptable, stop, G. Pemberton. Clara appeared at the kitchen door in her nightgown, rubbing sleepy eyes and clutching her teddy bear. She took one look at Jeremiah's face and knew that their borrowed time was running out. "Is it from Aunt Gertie?" she asked in a small voice. Jeremiah folded the telegram and tucked it into his vest pocket, forcing his expression to remain calm. "Just business, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." But Clara was too perceptive to be fooled by adult reassurances. She'd learned to read the subtle signs of impending abandonment, the tight line of grown-up mouths, the way conversation stopped when she entered a room, the careful kindness that felt like goodbye. After breakfast, while Jeremiah met with Pete about moving cattle to winter pasture, Clara slipped away from the house. Elena found her missing an hour later and raised the alarm, sending the entire ranch into a panic of searching. They found her as the sun reached its zenith, huddled in a small cave halfway up Eagle Ridge, where she'd tried to hide from a world that seemed determined to tear apart everything she'd learned to love. She was shivering despite the warm autumn day, her dress torn from brambles and her face streaked with tears and dirt. "Clara," Jeremiah called, relief flooding his voice as he spotted her small form in the shadows. "Thank God you're safe." "I'm not going back," she said, her voice fierce despite her chattering teeth. "I'll live in the mountains like the Indians." "I won't go to Aunt Gertie's." Jeremiah climbed into the cave and gathered her into his arms, feeling how small and fragile she was beneath her show of defiance. "Sweetheart, you can't live in a cave. You'd freeze when winter comes. I don't care. At least I'd be free." The word hung in the air between them. Freedom. Such a simple concept, yet so complicated when applied to a child's life. Clara had found freedom at the ranch, freedom to laugh and learn and love without fear. The thought of losing it was more terrifying than any physical hardship. Pete and Miguel had followed Jeremiah up the mountain, and together they coaxed Clara down to safety. But the message was clear. This child would rather face death than return to a life of emotional cruelty. Dr. Matthews made the journey to the ranch that evening, ostensibly to check Clara for injuries from her mountain adventure, but really to assess her mental state. What he found alarmed him. "She's running a fever," he told Jeremiah privately as Clara slept fitfully in the guest room. "Nothing serious physically, but her emotional distress is manifesting in physical symptoms. Separation trauma can be devastating to a child, especially one who's already experienced significant loss." "What are you saying, Doc?" "I'm saying that forcing this child to leave everything she's come to love could cause permanent psychological damage. In my medical opinion, it would be tantamount to abuse." That night, Jeremiah sat at his desk and penned the most important letter of his life. The words came slowly, each sentence carefully crafted to convey both his desperation and his dignity. "Dear Mrs. Pemberton," he began, "I write to you concerning your niece Clara, who has been in my care for the past week. While I understand and respect your legal rights as her aunt, I believe there may be a solution that serves everyone's best interests, particularly Clara's." He went on to describe Clara's condition, her obvious distress at the prospect of leaving Montana, and his own growing attachment to the child. Then came the part that cost him dearly to write. "I am prepared to offer you the sum of $5,000 in exchange for relinquishing your claim to Clara and consenting to my formal adoption of her. This would ensure her financial security while allowing her to..." remain in an environment where she has found happiness and stability. $5,000 represented nearly a third of his liquid assets, money he'd planned to use for expanding the ranch and securing his own retirement. But what good was financial security without someone to share it with, someone to carry on after he was gone? The response came by return telegraph, swift and brutal in its clarity. Mr. Boone's stop your offer reveals. Ignorance of situations. Stop. Child inherits. Substantial trust from her mother at age 18. Stop will not surrender. Guardianship at any price. Stop expect. Compliance with court order. Stop G. Pemberton. Jeremiah stared at the telegram, understanding flooding through him like ice water. Gertrude Pemberton wasn't interested in Clara's well-being or even in the money he'd offered. She wanted control of Clara's inheritance, money that wouldn't be available for 11 more years, but would be worth the wait if it was substantial enough. Clara was not a burden to be managed, but an investment to be controlled. Judge Whitman received Jeremiah in his chambers that afternoon, his expression grave as he reviewed the telegram and the doctor's medical assessment. "This puts a different complexion on things," he admitted. "If Mrs. Pemberton's primary motivation is financial gain rather than genuine concern for the child's welfare, we might have grounds for a challenge." What kind of grounds? Unfit guardianship based on mercenary motives. But we'd need substantial proof, and we'd have to move quickly. Mrs. Pemberton has filed papers with the territorial court, demanding immediate compliance with her custody rights. Jeremiah felt the walls closing in around them. Every legal avenue seemed to lead to the same dead end. Clara belonged to her aunt, by blood and by law, regardless of what was best for her emotional and physical well-being. That evening, Clara sat listlessly at the supper table, picking at Elena's famous cornbread and barely acknowledging the concerned glances of the people who'd become her family. The fever had broken, but her spirit seemed diminished, as if she was already beginning to withdraw from attachments that would soon cause her pain. "Clara," Jeremiah said gently, "I want you to know that I'm not giving up. No matter what happens, I will never stop fighting for you." She looked up at him with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. "Mama used to say that sometimes loving someone means letting them go. Maybe it's time to let go, Papa Jeremiah. Maybe fighting just makes it hurt worse." The words pierced him like a blade. This child, who had already suffered more loss than most adults, was trying to spare him the pain of losing her. She was protecting his heart even as her own was breaking. "Never," he said fiercely. "I will never let you go, Clara, not while there's breath in my body and fight in my soul." Outside, autumn was turning toward winter, and the mountains wore their first dusting of snow like a promise of the harsh months ahead. But inside the warm ranch house, a man and a child were discovering the true meaning of family. Not something determined by blood or law, but something forged in love and strengthened by the willingness to sacrifice everything for each other's happiness. The battle for Clara's future was far from over. The leather-bound ledger sat open on Jeremiah's desk like an accusation, its neat columns of figures representing decades of careful planning and calculated risks. 15,000 head of cattle, 3,000 acres of prime grazing land, investments in mining claims and railroad stock, all the tangible proof of a life spent building something permanent in an impermanent world. But as he studied the numbers by lamplight, Jeremiah realized that wealth without purpose was just an elaborate form of emptiness. What good was financial security if Clara wasn't there to inherit it? What meaning did his empire have if there was no one to carry on his name and values? Judge Whitman had been frank about their legal options. "There is one possibility," he'd said during their meeting that afternoon. "A rarely used provision in territorial law allows for custody challenges based on the child's best interests, but only if we can demonstrate that the current arrangement is actively harmful to the child's welfare." What would that require? Substantial evidence of the aunt's unfitness, testimony from credible witnesses, and most importantly, clear proof that removing Clara from your care would cause demonstrable harm. It's a high standard, Jeremiah. We'd essentially be asking the court to overturn centuries of legal precedent regarding family rights. Now, as Clara slept upstairs under Sarah's quilt, Jeremiah made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. If the law wouldn't protect Clara, then perhaps they needed to go beyond the law's reach. He began with small steps, quietly liquidating some investments, converting property deeds to more portable forms of wealth, researching remote territories where questions about a man and his daughter might not be asked too closely. Canada was vast and sparsely settled. California was still rough enough that a man with money could establish himself without too many inquiries about his past. Clara, meanwhile, had thrown herself into learning with the desperate intensity of someone trying to prove her worth. Martha Henderson arrived each morning to tutor her, and consistently marveled at the child's extraordinary abilities. "She's reading at a level most adults never achieve," Martha told Jeremiah privately, "and her mathematical comprehension is remarkable." This morning, she worked out compound interest calculations in her head that would challenge a bank clerk. Clara had also taken to spending hours in Jeremiah's study, surrounded by his books on cattle ranching, territorial law, and Western history. When he found her there one evening, she was carefully copying passages from a volume about Montana's statehood prospects. "What are you working on, sweetheart?" "I'm learning about the law," she said seriously. "If I understand how it works, maybe I can find a way to make it work for us." The sight of this small child, her brow furrowed in concentration as she struggled with concepts far beyond her years, nearly broke his heart. She was trying to solve adult problems with the determination of someone who'd learned that survival depended on being useful. "Being smart, being indispensable?" "Clara," he said gently, sitting beside her, "that's my job, not yours. You're supposed to be learning about arithmetic and reading stories, not worrying about legal proceedings. But if I can help, you help by being exactly who you are. You don't need to earn your place here, sweetheart. You belong because I love you, not because of anything you can do or know or figure out." She looked at him with those wise, sad eyes that had seen too much of life's uncertainties. "What if loving me isn't enough? What if the law says love doesn't matter?" It was a question that haunted him through the sleepless hours of the next several nights. What if love truly wasn't enough? What if all his wealth and influence and determination couldn't protect one small child from a system that valued legal technicalities over human happiness? The ranch hands had begun to sense the tension in the house. Pete found excuses to check on Clara throughout the day, teaching her to rope fence posts and showing her how to read weather signs in the movement of clouds. Miguel saved the choicest bits from his cooking for her plate, and Tommy carved her a small wooden horse that she treasured like the most precious gift. "Boss," Pete said one evening as they watched Clara help Eleanor feed the chickens, "the boys have been talking. If you need to take that little girl somewhere safe, well, there's plenty of us who'd be willing to ride along and make sure you get there." The offer touched Jeremiah deeply. These men, some of whom had worked for him for over a decade, were willing to risk their own futures to protect Clara's. It spoke to something fundamental about the bonds that formed between people who faced hardship together. "I appreciate that, Pete, more than you know. But I won't ask you men to become fugitives for my sake. Wouldn't be for your sake, boss. Would be for hers. That little girl's got more courage in her pinky finger than most men have in their whole bodies. She deserves better than what's waiting for her back east." As the days passed, Clara's nightmares returned with increasing intensity. Elena would find her sitting by the window in the pre-dawn darkness, staring out at the mountains as if memorizing their contours against some future when she might need to remember what home looked like. "Pequeña," Elena said one morning, sitting beside her on the window seat, "what troubles your dreams?" "I dream that I'm on a train, and I'm looking back, and the ranch gets smaller and smaller until I can't see it anymore. And Papa Jeremiah is standing by the fence, getting smaller too, until he disappears completely. Elena gathered the child into her arms, her own eyes bright with tears she couldn't shed in Clara's presence. Dreams are not always true, Mija. Sometimes they are just our fears talking, but sometimes they are true. Sometimes dreams tell us what's going to happen. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Dr. Matthews, who had been quietly conducting his own investigation into Gertrude Pemberton's background, arrived at the ranch with news that changed everything. "I've been corresponding with colleagues in Chicago," he told Jeremiah as they sat in the study after Clara had gone to bed. "Mrs. Pemberton's reputation is not what she claims. There have been incidents." "What kind of incidents?" "She was briefly married to a much older man who died under questionable circumstances. There were rumors of mistreatment, though nothing was ever proven. More recently, she's been involved in some shady financial dealings, investments that hurt other people while enriching herself." Jeremiah leaned forward, sensing opportunity. "Is any of this documented?" "Some of it. And there's more. She's been asking very specific questions about Clara's inheritance, amounts, trustees, when the money becomes available. Her interest seems entirely mercenary." For the first time in days, Jeremiah felt a spark of hope. If they could prove that Gertrude's motives were purely financial, if they could show a pattern of questionable behavior, they might have the evidence they needed to challenge her custody claim. But time was running short. Sheriff Morton had received another telegram that morning, this one threatening legal action against him personally if he didn't enforce the custody order immediately. "We have maybe 2 days, Judge Whitman had warned. "After that, I'll have no choice but to order Clara's removal, regardless of any pending investigations. 2 days to save a child's future. 2 days to prove that love and family were more than just words on a legal document." As Jeremiah tucked Clara into bed that night, she asked the question that had been haunting both of them. "Papa Jeremiah, what happens if we lose?" He smoothed her hair back from her forehead, choosing his words carefully. "Then we'll face whatever comes next together somehow. But Clara, I want you to remember something no matter what happens. You are loved. You are wanted. You are valuable just because you exist, not because of any money or inheritance or legal document. Can you remember that?" She nodded solemnly. "I'll remember. And I'll remember that you thought I was worth fighting for." Outside, the first winter storm was building over the mountains, bringing the promise of snow and the certainty of harder days ahead. But inside the ranch house, a father and daughter were preparing for the fight of their lives. Clara woke before dawn, her heart heavy with the decision that had been building in her young mind for days. The adults were trying so hard to protect her, sacrificing their own peace and security for her sake. And she couldn't bear to be the cause of so much trouble anymore. Moving quietly through the sleeping house, she made her way to the room where she'd been staying, gathering her few possessions with the careful deliberation of someone much older than her 7 years. The yellow dress Elena had altered, the book Martha Henderson had given her, the wooden horse Tommy had carved. Each item was a memory of kindness she would treasure forever. But it was when she opened her original suitcase, the battered leather case she'd carried from Denver, that everything changed. Hidden beneath her mother's faded shawl and a few letters tied with ribbon, Clara found things she'd forgotten in the trauma of her mother's death and the overwhelming kindness of her new life. There was her mother's Bible, its pages soft with handling, and a small velvet pouch that contained her mother's few pieces of jewelry, and there was a photograph. The image was faded but clear, a tintype portrait of a young woman standing beside a tall man in frontier clothes. The woman looked exactly like the painting that hung in Jeremiah's study. The one he'd told her was his beloved Sarah. But this wasn't Sarah. This was Clara's mother, Catherine. And the inscription on the back made Clara's small hands tremble. Catherine and James Boone. Wedding day, June 1875. Clara stared at the photograph, her young mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Her mother's name had been Catherine Pemberton, but the picture clearly showed her as Catherine Boone. And the man in the photograph, Clara had seen his face before, in a smaller portrait on Jeremiah's desk. It was Thomas Boone, Jeremiah's younger brother. With growing excitement, Clara dug deeper into the suitcase's hidden compartments. She found letters addressed to Mrs. James Boone and a marriage certificate that confirmed what the photograph suggested. Her mother had been married to Jeremiah's brother, making Clara not just an orphaned stranger, but Jeremiah's own great-niece. But there was more. Among the papers was a letter in her mother's careful handwriting, addressed to my dearest brother-in-law Jeremiah, but never sent. My dear Jeremiah, it began. I pray this letter finds you well and at peace. James spoke of you often with love and regret for the harsh words that drove him away from home. He never stopped hoping for reconciliation, never stopped telling Clara stories about her uncle Jeremiah, who built a great ranch in Montana and who had the kindest heart of any man he'd ever known. Clara's eyes filled with tears. As she read on, James died last winter of pneumonia, and I fear my own health is failing. Clara is all I have left of him, and she is so much like the Boone family he described, strong and determined and wise beyond her years. If anything happens to me, I pray you will find it in your heart to forgive old grievances and help her. She is your blood, Jeremiah, your brother's daughter, and she carries the best of both our families within her. The letter was dated just 3 months ago, with a note at the bottom. I am traveling to Montana in hopes of finding you. Clara needs family who will love her for herself, not for what she can provide them. Clara sat in stunned silence, pieces of her life's puzzle finally clicking into place. Her mother hadn't been traveling aimlessly when she died in Denver. She'd been trying to reach Jeremiah, trying to bring Clara home to family who would understand what it meant to love unconditionally. The coincidence of Clara being abandoned at the very train station where Jeremiah would find her suddenly seemed like destiny, or perhaps her dying mother's final, desperate plan to ensure her daughter would be safe. Footsteps in the hallway interrupted her thoughts, and Clara quickly gathered the documents and photograph. She had to show Jeremiah, had to tell him what she'd discovered. But as she stood to leave the room, she heard voices downstairs. Sheriff Morton had arrived early, and the conversation was urgent and grim. I'm sorry, Jeremiah, but I can't hold them off any longer. Federal marshals are coming on the noon train to enforce the custody order. If Clara isn't on the eastbound by tonight, they'll arrest both of us for obstruction of justice. Clara's heart pounded as she crept to the top of the stairs, clutching the photograph to her chest. Through the banister, she could see Jeremiah's face, etched with desperation and defeat. Harold, give me one more day. Just 24 hours. I have new evidence that might change everything. What kind of evidence? I can't say yet. But it's substantial, enough to challenge the entire custody arrangement. Sheriff Morton shook his head reluctantly. The marshals won't wait for new evidence. They have their orders and I have mine. Clara leaves today, Jeremiah. That's final. Clara took a deep breath and walked down the stairs, the photograph held carefully in her small hands. Every adult eye turned to her as she entered the room, and she could see the pain they were trying to hide from her. Papa Jeremiah, she said quietly, I found something you need to see. She handed him the photograph, watching as his face went through a series of emotions, confusion, recognition, and finally stunned realization. Dear God, he whispered, staring at the image of his brother. Catherine! Clara, where did you get this? It was in my suitcase with Mama's things. There are letters, too, and a marriage certificate. Papa Jeremiah, my mama was Catherine Boone. Your brother James was my papa. Sheriff Morton leaned over to examine the photograph, his official skepticism warring with growing amazement. If this is authentic, it changes everything, Jeremiah finished, his voice hoarse with emotion. Clara isn't just some orphan I took in. She's family, my brother's daughter, my own bloodkin. Clara pulled out the unsent letter, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Mama wrote you a letter, but she never got to send it. She wanted me to know you, wanted me to come home to family who would love me. As Jeremiah read his dead sister-in-law's words, tears streamed down his weathered face. 20 years of estrangement from his brother, 20 years of regret and stubborn pride. And all along, James had been trying to find his way back home. He died without reconciliation, But he'd left behind this precious gift, a daughter who carried the best of the Boone family legacy. "Sheriff," Jeremiah said, his voice gaining strength, "this photograph and these documents prove that Clara is my great-niece, my direct blood relative. That gives me a stronger legal claim than any distant aunt, but you'll need to prove authenticity, get sworn testimony, file proper papers, then that's what we'll do. But Clara is not leaving this ranch. Not today, not ever. She's coming home, Harold. She's been trying to come home her whole life." Clara ran to Jeremiah's arms, and he lifted her up, holding her as if he'd never let her go. For the first time since Sheriff Morton had delivered that first terrible telegram, hope blazed bright and strong in the ranch house kitchen. "Papa Jeremiah," Clara whispered against his neck, "does this mean I can stay? Does this mean I really belong here?" "You've always belonged here, sweetheart. We just didn't know it yet." Outside, the federal marshals were still coming on the noon train. Gertrude Pemberton was still demanding custody of her niece. The legal system was still stacked against them, but now they had something more powerful than law or money or social convention. They had truth. They had blood. They had a family connection that went deeper than any court order. They had proof that some stories really did have happy endings, even when they began with abandonment and loss. Clara Boone, for that was truly her name, was finally coming home. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge had never seen such a flurry of activity. Within hours of Clara's revelation, Judge Whitman had called an emergency hearing, and the entire town seemed to buzz with news of the dramatic turn in the custody case. Jeremiah's attorneys worked frantically to authenticate the documents, while Clara sat quietly in the judge's chambers, her precious teddy bear in her lap, answering gentle questions about her mother and the papers she'd discovered. "The marriage certificate appears genuine," William Hartley reported to Jeremiah as they prepared for the hearing. "The seal matches records from the Denver courthouse, and the handwriting on the letters is consistent throughout. But Mrs. Pemberton's attorney will challenge everything, claim the documents are forgeries, question the chain of custody, argue that even if authentic, they don't change the established legal relationship. What's our strongest argument? That Clara is your blood relative, making you next of kin with superior claim to a distant aunt. But Jeremiah, we're still facing an uphill battle. Mrs. Pemberton has been Clara's legal guardian for months, even if only by default. Courts don't like disrupting established arrangements without compelling reasons. Martha Henderson arrived with an armload of law books, her teacher's instincts mobilized for the fight ahead. "I've been researching territorial precedents," she announced. "There are 3 cases where blood relationship trumped existing guardianship arrangements. But all involved proof of abuse or neglect." "Then we prove neglect," Dr. Matthews interjected, entering with his medical bag and a stern expression. "Emotional neglect, financial exploitation, failure to consider the child's best interests. It's all documented in my reports, Clara." Listen to the adult conversations swirling around her with the careful attention of someone whose fate hung in the balance. She'd grown accustomed to being discussed rather than consulted, but now she felt different, stronger somehow, knowing that she truly belonged to this family that was fighting so hard for her. The federal marshals had arrived on the noon train as promised, 2 stern-faced men in dark suits who conferred quietly with Sheriff Morton before taking up positions at the courthouse. Their presence added an air of federal authority that made everyone speak in hushed tones and move with careful precision. "Clara," Judge Whitman said gently, kneeling beside her chair, "I know this is frightening, but I need you to be very brave today. Can you do that for me?" She nodded solemnly, her small hands smoothing her teddy bear's worn fur. "Yes, sir. Mama always said that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right even when you are scared. Your mama was a wise woman." The afternoon brought an unexpected development. A telegram arrived from Chicago, delivered by Billy Morrison, who'd ridden his pony harder than ever before to earn his delivery fee. Judge Whitman read it privately, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Gentlemen," he announced to the assembled lawyers. "Mrs. Pemberton is not coming to contest this hearing personally. She sent her attorney, Mr. Harrison Blackwood, with full authority to represent her interests." Jeremiah felt a chill of apprehension. Blackwood was known throughout the Western Territories as a ruthless corporate lawyer who specialized in winning cases through intimidation and legal technicalities rather than justice. If Gertrude Pemberton had hired him, she was serious about maintaining control over Clara and her eventual inheritance. Elena had arrived with a clean dress for Clara, the blue one that brought out her eyes and made her look like the little lady she was becoming. As the older woman helped Clara change clothes, she spoke softly in Spanish, offering blessings and prayers for protection. "Mija," Elena said, braiding Clara's hair with gentle hands, "remember that you are loved. Whatever happens in that courtroom, you are surrounded by people who think you are precious beyond measure." Clara hugged Elena tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of flour and cinnamon that always seemed to cling to the woman who'd become like a grandmother to her. "Elena, if I have to go away, will you take care of Buttercup for me? She gets lonely if no one visits her." "You are not going anywhere, Pequeña. This is your home, and homes don't let their children go without a fight." The most emotional moment came when Clara discovered Sarah's wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper in the cedar chest at the foot of Jeremiah's bed. Elena had brought it down to show her, thinking it might bring comfort to know about the woman who would have been like a mother to her. Clara touched the ivory silk with reverent fingers, marveling at the delicate pearl buttons and the fine lace that had yellowed slightly with age. "She was beautiful, wasn't she?" "Very beautiful," Jeremiah confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have loved you so much, Clara. She always wanted children, always dreamed of having a little girl to teach and love. Do you think she knows about me now? Do you think she's happy that I'm here?" Jeremiah knelt beside the chest, meeting Clara's eyes with complete sincerity. "I think she sent you to me. I think she and your mama worked together somehow to make sure you found your way home." Clara considered this with the seriousness of a child who'd learned that adults sometimes told beautiful lies to make hard truths more bearable. But looking into Jeremiah's face, she saw only honest conviction, and it comforted her more than any platitude could have. The hearing was set for 4 o'clock, giving them barely 2 hours to prepare their case. Pete arrived with several of the ranch hands, all dressed in their Sunday best and ready to testify about Clara's character and her obvious happiness at the ranch. Tommy had even brought his carved wooden horse, thinking it might help show the judge how much Clara was loved by everyone who knew her. Dr. Matthews spent an hour coaching Clara on how to answer questions in court, emphasizing the importance of telling the truth but not volunteering information that wasn't asked for. "Just be yourself," he advised. "Let them see the intelligent, brave little girl we all know you to be." But it was Pastor Williams who provided the most practical advice. "Child," he said, taking Clara's hands in his gentle grasp, "remember that judges are people too. They have children and grandchildren of their own, and they understand love when they see it. Show them how much you love Mr. Boone, and show them how much he loves you. Truth has a way of shining through all the legal complications." As the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself thinking about her mother's last days, trying to remember conversations that might have seemed unimportant at the time, but now carried weight. She recalled her mother saying something about going home to family, about making sure Clara would be safe with people who understand what it means to love a child. "Papa Jeremiah," Clara said as they prepared to walk to the courthouse, "I remember something Mama said before she died. She said she was taking me to my real family, to people who would love me because I belonged to them, not because they had to." Jeremiah felt his heart constrict with love and admiration for this remarkable child. Even in her fear, she was thinking about others, trying to help their case with memories that might make the difference between staying and going. The walk to the courthouse felt like a funeral procession, with Clara's small hand tucked securely in Jeremiah's larger one. The entire town seemed to have turned out to watch, faces pressed against windows and small crowds gathering on street corners. Word had spread about the custody battle, and public opinion was clearly on Clara's side. "Whatever happens in there," Jeremiah told her as they climbed the courthouse steps, "remember that you are Clara Boone, and you are loved beyond measure. Can you remember that?" "I'll remember," she promised, squaring her small shoulders with determination that would have made her parents proud. "And I'll remember that sometimes the best things come from the hardest fights." Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with tension and the weight of impending decision. Clara took her place beside Jeremiah at the plaintiff's table, her teddy bear carefully positioned on her lap and her chin raised with quiet dignity. Harrison Blackwood sat across the aisle, a thin man with calculating eyes and an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the frontier courthouse. He shuffled through papers with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning, regardless of the human cost. Judge Whitman entered, and the room fell silent. Clara felt Jeremiah's hand squeeze hers gently, a reminder that whatever came next, they would face it together. The battle for her future was about to begin. The gavel struck the wooden bench with the finality of thunder, and Judge Whitman's voice filled the packed courtroom with measured authority. "This hearing will determine the custody of Clara Catherine Boone, age 7 years, currently residing with Jeremiah Boone of Cedar Ridge, Montana Territory." Clara sat perfectly still beside Jeremiah, her small hands folded over her teddy bear as she'd been instructed. The courtroom was filled to capacity with townspeople who'd come to witness what many saw as a battle between justice and bureaucracy. Between love and legal technicality, Harrison Blackwood rose first, his expensive suit and polished demeanor commanding immediate attention. "Your Honor, I represent Mrs. Gertrude Pemberton of Chicago, Illinois, the lawful aunt and guardian of the child in question. Mrs. Pemberton has legal documents establishing her guardianship, dating back several months to the child's mother's death." He produced a sheaf of papers with theatrical precision, each document bearing official seals and legal language that sounded impressive to untrained ears. "The law is clear on this matter, Your Honor. Blood relations take precedence in custody matters, and Mrs. Pemberton is the child's closest living relative, having been granted guardianship by the Denver Probate Court." Judge Whitman examined the documents carefully, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Mr. Blackwood, I see here that Mrs. Pemberton was granted guardianship in absentia without the child present for testimony. Is that correct?" "That's standard procedure when the child is a minor and the relationship is clearly established. Your Honor, Mrs. Pemberton is Catherine Pemberton's sister, making her Clara's aunt and legal next of kin. And yet," William Hartley interjected, rising from the plaintiff's table, "we now have evidence that calls into question the very foundation of that relationship." Hartley approached the bench with the Boone family Bible, opened to the genealogical records that had been kept for 3 generations. "Your Honor, this family Bible documents that Catherine Pemberton was, in fact, Catherine Boone, legally married to James Boone, brother to my client Jeremiah Boone. This makes Clara not Mrs. Pemberton's niece, but Mr. Boone's great-niece, and his claim as blood relative supersedes any distant aunt's rights." Blackwood's confident expression flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Objection, Your Honor. These so-called documents have not been properly authenticated. Anyone could have written entries in a family Bible. We need official marriage certificates, death records, documentation that meets legal standards." "We have those as well," Hartley replied smoothly, producing the marriage certificate Clara had found in her suitcase. "This document, issued by the Denver County Clerk in 1875, clearly shows the marriage between Catherine Pemberton and James Boone. It bears the official seal and signature of the county clerk." Judge Whitman studied the certificate with the magnifying glass he kept for examining fine print on legal documents. The courtroom held its collective breath as he scrutinized every detail: the paper, the ink, the official seals that could mean the difference between Clara staying or leaving. "Mr. Blackwood, do you wish to challenge the authenticity of this document?" Blackwood examined the certificate himself, his sharp eyes looking for any flaw that might discredit it. "The document appears to be genuine, Your Honor, but I question the chain of custody. How do we know these papers weren't planted or fabricated after the fact? The child had ample opportunity to construct false evidence with help from interested parties." Clara's grip tightened on her teddy bear, and she looked up at Jeremiah with wide eyes. She'd never heard anyone suggest that she was capable of lying about something so important, and the accusation stung like a physical blow. "Your Honor," Hartley said firmly, "I'd like to call Clara Boone to testify about how these documents came into her possession." "Objection!" Blackwood stood quickly. "The child is 7 years old and clearly coached by the plaintiff. Her testimony would be unreliable and prejudicial." Judge Whitman considered this, studying Clara's small face with the attention of a man who'd spent decades learning to read character and truth in the faces of those who appeared before him. "I'll allow limited questioning, keeping in mind the child's age and emotional state. Clara, would you come forward, please?" The walk to the witness chair felt like the longest journey of Clara's short life. Every eye in the courtroom was upon her, and she could feel the weight of adult expectations and hopes pressing down on her small shoulders. But as she climbed into the chair, she remembered Elena's words about being surrounded by love, and she drew strength from that thought. "Clara," Judge Whitman said gently, "do you understand the difference between telling the truth and telling a lie?" "Yes, sir. The truth is what really happened, even if it's hard to say. A lie is saying something that didn't happen, usually to avoid getting in trouble. And do you promise to tell me the truth about everything I ask you?" "Yes, sir. Mama taught me that lies always make things worse, even when they seem easier." Judge Whitman nodded approvingly. This child possessed a wisdom and directness that impressed him, and he sensed that whatever she was about to tell them would be both truthful and significant. "Now, Clara, can you tell us about the papers you found in your suitcase?" Clara's voice was clear and steady as she began to speak, her small hands smoothing her teddy bear's worn fur for comfort. "I found them yesterday morning when I was getting ready to run away. I didn't want to cause Papa Jeremiah any more trouble, so I was packing my things." "And where exactly did you find these papers?" "In the bottom of my suitcase, under Mama's shawl. There was a secret pocket I'd never looked in before. Mama always told me not to touch her private things, but she's gone now, and I thought maybe there might be something important." Judge Whitman leaned forward, his expression intent. "Had you seen these documents before yesterday?" "No, sir. I didn't even know Mama had been married to anyone except my papa. She never talked about him much, just said he'd gone away before I was born, and that it made her too sad to remember." Harrison Blackwood stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I must object again. This child's testimony is clearly rehearsed. She's been coached to provide exactly the answers needed to support the plaintiff's case." But before Judge Whitman could respond, Clara turned in her chair and looked directly at the lawyer with the fearless honesty that only children possess. "I don't know what rehearsed means, sir, but nobody told me what to say. I'm telling you exactly what happened because that's what Mama taught me to do. She said that telling the truth is the most important thing a person can do, even when it's scary." A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom, and Judge Whitman had to rap his gavel lightly to restore order. Continue, Clara. Tell us about the photograph you found." Clara's face brightened slightly as she remembered. "It was a picture of Mama and a man I'd never seen before, but he looked like the pictures Papa Jeremiah has of his brother. On the back it said Catherine and James Boone wedding day. That's when I knew Mama had been a Boone before she was a Pemberton." "And the letter your mother wrote?" "She wrote to Papa Jeremiah but never sent it. She said Papa James used to tell stories about his brother who had a big ranch in Montana, and she wanted me to know my real family if anything happened to her." Blackwood tried a different approach. "Clara, do you understand that Mrs. Pemberton is your aunt and wants to take care of you?" Clara's expression grew troubled, and she looked toward Jeremiah for reassurance before answering. "Aunt Gertie came to see us once in Denver. She was very angry with Mama and said mean things about me not having a proper father."
She made Mama cry.
And she said I was a burden that nobody should have to carry. Children sometimes misunderstand adult conversations. I didn't misunderstand, Clara interrupted with quiet firmness. She said I was God's punishment for Mama's sins, and that I should be grateful if anyone was willing to take me because I was nobody's real daughter. But Papa Jeremiah says I'm his real daughter now, and that love makes families, not just blood. The silence that followed was profound. Even Blackwood seemed momentarily at a loss for words in the face of such honest testimony from a child who had clearly suffered emotional cruelty. Dr. Matthews was called to testify next, presenting his medical evaluation of Clara's physical and emotional health. In my professional opinion, he stated firmly, removing this child from her current environment would constitute a form of psychological abuse. She has thrived under Mr. Boone's care, gaining weight, showing marked improvement in sleep patterns, and demonstrating remarkable intellectual and emotional growth. Pastor Williams followed, speaking about the spiritual transformation he'd witnessed in both Jeremiah and Clara. I've watched this man for 20 years, seen him through grief and loss. The arrival of this child has brought him back to life. And Clara has found not just a home, but a calling. She belongs here as surely as the mountains belong to Montana. But it was Martha Henderson's testimony that proved most damaging to Blackwood's case. The school teacher had conducted her own investigation into Gertrude Pemberton's background. Corresponding with colleagues in Chicago, Mrs. Pemberton has shown no interest in Clara's education or well-being, Martha testified. Her inquiries have focused exclusively on the child's financial inheritance. She has asked specific questions about trust funds, investment accounts, and when Clara would gain access to her mother's estate. There has been no mention of love, care, or the child's emotional needs. Blackwood's final gambit was to present financial statements showing Gertrude Pemberton's substantial wealth and social standing in Chicago society. Mrs. Pemberton can provide educational opportunities, cultural advantages, and social connections that a frontier ranch cannot offer. Clara would have access to the finest schools, the best tutors, a refined upbringing appropriate to her station. But when Judge Whitman asked Clara directly what she wanted, her answer was simple and devastating to Blackwood's case. "I want to stay home," she said, her voice carrying the absolute conviction of a child who knew her own heart. "I want to stay with Papa Jeremiah and Elena and Miguel and all the people who love me. I don't want to be refined or educated away from my family. I want to belong somewhere, and I belong here." Judge Whitman called for a brief recess, but as he left the bench, Clara could see in his eyes that her words had reached him. Now her teddy bear seemed less like a security blanket and more like a witness to her courage. The decision that would determine her future was only minutes away. 6 months had passed since Judge Whitman delivered his decision in the packed Cedar Ridge courthouse. But Clara still remembered every word of his ruling as clearly as if he'd spoken them yesterday. "After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony," he had said, his voice carrying the weight of Solomon's wisdom, "this court finds that Clara Catherine Boone's best interests are served by remaining with her great-uncle, Jeremiah Boone, who has demonstrated both the legal standing and moral fitness to serve as her guardian. The blood relationship established through authentic documentation supersedes any distant familial claims, and the child's own testimony regarding her emotional well-being cannot be ignored." The courtroom had erupted in cheers, and Clara had run straight into Jeremiah's arms, finally able to believe that she was truly home forever. Harrison Blackwood had stormed out with threats of appeals that never materialized, and Gertrude Pemberton had apparently decided that a legal fight she couldn't win wasn't worth the expense. Now, on a crisp spring morning in 1885, Clara sat at the kitchen table working on her lessons with Martha Henderson, while Elena hummed softly as she prepared lunch. The ranch house had come alive in ways Jeremiah had never imagined possible, filled with the sounds of childhood, laughter echoing from the barn where Clara helped Tommy with the horses, excited chatter about books and arithmetic problems. The gentle sound of a child's voice singing her mother's lullabies. "Clara," Martha said, looking up from the arithmetic problems Clara had solved with remarkable speed. "I believe you're ready for more advanced studies. Your mathematical abilities are extraordinary for someone your age." Clara beamed at the praise, but her attention was drawn to the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. Through the window, she could see Jeremiah returning from his morning ride around the property, and she abandoned her studies to run outside and greet him. This had become their daily ritual, Clara racing across the yard to meet him, Jeremiah swinging down from his horse to catch her in a fierce hug that lifted her feet off the ground. It was a simple gesture, but it represented everything they'd fought for, the right to love each other without fear of separation, the security of knowing that home meant forever. "How are the lessons going, sweetheart?" he asked, settling her on his hip as he'd done countless times before. "Martha says I'm ready for more advanced arithmetic. And I finished reading the whole book about the explorers in the Oregon Territory. That's my brilliant girl. What do you want to study next?" Clara considered this seriously, as she did all questions about her education. "I want to learn about the law, so I can help other children who don't have families find the right ones." The answer didn't surprise him. Clara had developed a passionate interest in justice and fairness, perhaps born from her own experience with the legal system. She often spoke about wanting to help people who couldn't help themselves, and Jeremiah suspected she would grow up to be a formidable advocate for the powerless. Their afternoon ritual took them to the meadow, where Clara had first learned to ride Buttercup. Now a confident young horsewoman who could handle the gentle mare with skill that impressed even Pete. Today, they were joined by a special visitor. Dr. Matthews had brought his camera equipment to take a formal portrait of the newly legal father and daughter. "This will be for the family album," he explained, positioning his bulky camera on its tripod. "Every family needs proper photographs to mark important occasions." Clara wore the blue dress Elena had made for her, with her hair carefully braided and adorned with wildflowers. Jeremiah had donned his best suit, the one he'd worn to court all those months ago. But it was their expressions that made the photograph truly special, the unmistakable look of two people who had found their missing pieces in each other. "Hold still now," Dr. Matthews instructed, ducking beneath the camera's black cloth. "This will capture how happy you both look, and someday Clara's children will see this picture and know how much love surrounded their mother's childhood." The formal portrait joined several others in the family album Jeremiah had started. Pictures of Clara with the ranch hands, with Elena and Miguel, with her beloved horse Buttercup. Each image told the story of a child who had been welcomed not just into a home, but into a community that had embraced her as their own. That evening, as had become their custom, Clara and Jeremiah sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Clara had grown taller over the months, her legs now reaching the porch rail when she sat in her favorite chair. But she still clutched her teddy bear during these quiet moments of reflection. "Papa Jeremiah," she said, using the title that had become as natural as breathing, "do you ever miss being alone?" "Before I came, I mean." He considered the question carefully, looking out at the vast ranch that had once felt more like a monument to loneliness than a home. "I thought I liked being alone," he said finally. "But I think I was just afraid of caring about someone and losing them again. You taught me that love is worth the risk. Mama used to say that love doesn't make us weaker. It makes us braver. Your mama was a wise woman. I wish I could have met her, could have thanked her for raising such a remarkable daughter." Clara snuggled closer to his side, secure in the knowledge that these conversations were theirs to have for years to come. "I think she knows. I think she and Sarah and Papa James are all happy that we found each other." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Jeremiah reflected on how completely his life had changed since that September evening, when he'd found a small girl sitting on a suitcase at the train station. He'd thought he was rescuing her, but she had rescued him just as surely, from loneliness, from the emptiness of a life without purpose. from the fear that his best days were behind him. Now, with Clara's hand tucked trustingly in his, and the vast Montana landscape spreading out before them like a promise of tomorrow's adventures, Jeremiah Boone knew that his real life had finally begun. Clara Boone was home where she belonged, surrounded by love that would last a lifetime.